Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jake Spiegler, and I'd like to welcome you to our 9th KM KSU webinar. I'm a graduate student here at Kent State University, and I will be one of your event facilitators over the next year. The KM KSU webinars are an open forum for anyone engaged or interested in knowledge management or knowledge sciences. In this community, we define knowledge sciences broadly and inclusively. Events and webinars are offered to expand the dialogue and also to provide exposure to people and organizations who are doing great things in this area, to advance ideas, and to discuss challenges. We want this to be your forum, so we encourage you to propose events such as topics, events, and as we mentioned in our kickoff session, are not limited to just presentations, but can be open conversations and discussions, interviews, and so on. We're receiving very many interesting suggestions, and we have volunteers for another half a dozen events. Please do keep the ideas coming. This is an open forum which operates under a Creative Commons governance model. It is also a community without formal funding, so I want to always take time to acknowledge the contributions of our team here at Kent State, including Gianna Krensko, our Academic Program Coordinator, Nicole Stempak, another one of our graduate assistants, and our Goodyear Professor of Knowledge Management, Denise Bedford. Now let me introduce our speaker for today. Barabara Fillip is the Knowledge Management Project Manager with the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. She has been working as a contractor at the Goddard since 2008, first working in the Office of the Chief Knowledge Officer, and now directly supporting the Flight Project Directorate since 2011. In that capacity, she provides direct support. She provides direct support to projects through the development of project learning plans, implementation of pause and learn sessions to facilitate project learning, as well as the design and implementation of knowledge sharing workshops. In addition, Barbara aggregates project lessons and insights in a web of knowledge maps within the Flight Project Directorate's Knowledge Exchange. Prior to joining Goddard, Barbara worked as a research consultant and evaluation specialist supporting organizational learning and training functions. Primarily in the field of international development, Barbara earned a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and a master's degree from Columbia University. And without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Barbara.
Great, thank you, Jake. And I think we tested the audio, so I hope everybody can hear me well. I will try to keep an eye on the chat if you have any questions. So I'm going to go through, it's not really a PowerPoint presentation, so I shouldn't call them charts, but a few screens. And I'll try to pause in specific places to allow you to ask for questions, but if I don't and I try to go too fast, just slow me down and we'll be okay. So I work at the Goddard Space Flight Center, like Jake said. So that's one of 10 centers within NASA. So there are 10 centers, a few other facilities, and then the headquarters office in Washington. So I'm in Greenbelt, Maryland. And within the Goddard Space Flight Center, I work within the Flight Project Directorate. So essentially, what that means is I work for the equivalent of the Project Management Office. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the context, then I'll show you the knowledge flow model that I've put together. We'll do a small demo based on what I'm able to show you. And then I really want to talk about some of the challenges that I'm encountering, and I hope we'll have time for Q&A, but feel free to ask questions as I speak. So in terms of organizational context, so what we do here at Goddard are NASA missions. We're specialized in Earth science missions, meaning sending up satellites that essentially look down at Earth, as opposed to planetary science and other things that look at far distance in the universe and all kinds of other things. But we also do a little bit of everything. So we're one of the biggest centers, and we have a huge staff of scientists and engineers. I'm neither of those. I don't have a scientific background at all. I'm not an engineer. But somehow I managed to work on knowledge management for these folks. It's kind of a paradox. So I work for the Project Management Office here, and most of what I focus on is really lessons learned or best practices or things related to project management specifically, which helps so I don't try to tackle the technical issues and the very difficult engineering challenges that people encounter. It is a very complex project environment in the sense that we have missions that are typically quite expensive. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for a typical project or mission. They tend to be unique, and people here tend to say that we don't build the same thing twice, therefore it's very hard to draw lessons. But that's really the wrong kind of thinking. So I try to make them think in terms of, well, there are project management lessons or some kind of lessons around even engineering that can apply even if you do not build the same thing twice. So it's kind of challenging to work with, in a way, a lot of very, very smart people and still make them think in terms of what did we learn as a project on this in this experience? What did we learn that could be useful to others? So what I do in terms of lessons learned is really only one of several related processes. So for example, I put on the map here, anytime there is a mishap or something doesn't launch properly or falls off even before it's launched, anytime there is some kind of mishap, there is a very rigorous investigation. And those tend to result in very important lessons learned that are then embedded into practices and processes and all that. So I don't deal with those. I use them when there are some, but they're kind of parallel processes in terms of lessons. All right, let's move on to the next one. So more specifically related to the lessons learned context. And this is changing, so I'll talk to what has been the case up to now, but it is evolving very quickly. There was a policy or mandate, a requirement that said essentially the project will write or generate lessons learned. It wasn't very specific in terms of how they would do it or how often or whatever. It wasn't very very detailed in terms of telling the projects what to do, which the project likes because they don't want to be told exactly what to do. So all these lessons were meant to be put into a lessons learned database. And there is such a thing. There is a lessons learned information system, LLIS, that most of it is public and is accessible on the web. In the end, very few people were using this database and very few people were contributing to it. And that resulted in 2012 into an OIG report, an Office of the Inspector General's Office report, that was very critical of the NASA Lessons Learned Information System. Now, I could go on and on for a long time about why this was the case and why the lessons learned system didn't work, but I won't go there. It's kind of sensitive. The point is, this system or this mandate that existed focused entirely on official lessons learned, and it turned out that the centers and the project did much more than that in other areas, such as knowledge sharing workshops, a lot of databases of other types that were not lessons learned. There were a lot of things going on around knowledge management that were not captured in this lessons learned database. So I'll leave that at that. The policy is changing at the moment, so there will be something coming up new that will help us move forward. In terms of implementation, what was typically happening was that a project would identify one individual on the team to write lessons learned. And this may or may not have been someone who would go talk to the rest of the team and capture lessons. Often it was a contractor team that was asked to go capture lessons and then put them in the system. Alternatively, all members of the team are asked to contribute to lessons, and you end up with a huge number of lessons put into a single document. I've had this experience recently where they asked team members to come up with their lessons, and I was sent a document, a spreadsheet that aggregated 80-something lessons. And I couldn't really do much with that. I had to go back to them and ask them to do something, to work with them to figure out what to do with those lessons. And I'll get to why in a moment. So what we try to do is something a little more meaningful than just lessons learned and how to get them. So I call this the virtuous cycle of learning. I can't even pronounce it. I always have trouble. So we're going to go in this direction, from individual reflection to the collection of raw lessons, in this direction, and that's there, it goes in both directions. So this is where I start talking about the knowledge flows in the project environment. And let me stop here one second. I forgot to mention that I'm not using PowerPoint. I'm using a software, mapping software called CMap tools. And this is what I use for all the work I do with the project. I create maps, knowledge maps, using this tool. So when you see a little icon like this, it provides the ability to link to all kinds of other documents or other maps. So I've built this presentation using the tool, and I can click and go to these slides as needed. Before I go into this, are there any questions regarding the context within which I work, in terms of NASA and Goddard and the work that is done by the organization? Okay, I'm going to keep going, and feel free to post questions in the chat. So here I put in dotted lines everything, or the things that happen. The things that happen whether I do anything or not. Individual reflection happens all the time within the project. People think about what their experience has been. On-the-job learning just happens naturally. Whether they push a little bit and write down their thoughts, their lessons individually or not, that's up to them. But what we end up with is what I call a collections of raw lessons. And so if these are just kept like that, it's useful at the individual level. It's not that useful at the organizational level, because you're relying on individuals to transfer whatever they've learned to the next team they get attached to. So that happens, and that's great, but it's just not enough. So what we try to do is process all these raw lessons through what we call the pause and learn. And this is essentially a group reflection activity. So I'll go there. So the pause and learn is a way of unpacking people's experiences, articulating and validating the lessons within the team. It's really a team activity. We try to limit attendance to just the team. I mean, I've seen instances where management or even headquarters is invited, and that kind of changes the nature of the conversation. You really want to have an internal conversation within the project about what happened, what went well, what didn't go well. It's the equivalent of an after-action review in many ways. We just call it a pause and learn. So the key to plan for one of these sessions is to identify the key themes to be addressed beforehand, determine who will be there. Scheduling it is actually perhaps the most difficult thing, even when the project manager and the project management team is very committed to doing this. To actually find the time for people to show up in one room is somehow the most difficult thing to do. So we hold the panel conversation, somebody takes notes, and there's a facilitator. And then these notes are transformed into what I call conversation maps. And within the conversation maps, we highlight the key insights or lessons. Yep. Another approach is to use the map, to use the notes taken to start creating other outputs such as case studies. Goddard, the Chief Knowledge Officer here, Ed Rogers, is very well known within Goddard and even outside for his application of the case study method within NASA. So we have a lot of case studies that are based on Goddard and other NASA experiences. Those are very, very useful in workshops to try to transfer knowledge, especially of critical incidents or critical things across different projects. All right, so I'm going to show you a little bit about what I mean by a conversation map. Although this one is I have to talk a little bit about what this is about. So this is part of the what I would call the mini demo I'm going to give you. This is actually a screenshot from the knowledge exchange, which is where I put all of the knowledge maps, conversation maps for the flag projects directory. Now you see that it says NASA internal use only. Well, I'm allowed to show you this particular slide because it's based entirely on public information. So this one is about a project, NOAA and Prime. This is a satellite that was, well, is now up in the sky. It's a weather and climate prediction satellite. So, and you can see it's fallen in the factory where it was being built and tested. This happened in 2003, I believe. So it's not a new story, it's an old story, it's a well-known, well-documented story. And this particular map is about safety issues related to this incident. So you don't need to read the whole thing, but it has, you know, and this particular map is actually more linear than most of the maps I built. This one was built based on several documents, official documents, rather than the specific pause and learn section. Although at the time, pause and learn sessions were done with this project, almost as therapy for the project team, for them to speak up and talk about what had happened. It's very traumatic for a team when something like this happens. The satellite is upright, there's some big mistake, misunderstanding, miscommunication, whatever, safety isn't handled the way it should be. The whole satellite falls off, millions of dollars of damage. This is a big deal. People get really almost emotional about these types of events. So you get a map like this, and here you see detailed recommendation in lesson plan report. So I'm able to point to other documents with links like this embedded in the map, and I'm able to point to other maps. So here I'm going to show you how these lower level, I call lower level maps, which are project specific, are aggregated at a higher level. So here this particular box says every team member should feel empowered to voice concern and not have them ignored. There must be open communication among the team members. Sounds obvious, but in that instance there was a problem around communications, and there was a junior engineer who, even though he said something, he had seen something that didn't look right, he really wasn't listened to, and didn't push. So there's a lot of issues around what we call organizational silence. So if I click on this, I'm going to go to a map that aggregates all of the insights or lessons around communications issues that I've gathered from all of the projects that are in the system. Unfortunately, I'm not able to, these are all full of information. I'm not able to show you the whole thing, so I could only reproduce a little bit of it. So here you have the comment that you saw earlier, specific to NOAA and Prime. Imagine for a second all of these other little bubbles filled with information about lessons from other projects. And so I sort of aggregate them around topics. And there's no science to it. It's just they come in different shapes and forms, and I sort of aggregate them into these bigger packages. So here on this map, you can link to additional resources related to this topic. You can also link to other maps. So I have other maps in the system related to decision making, organizing and staffing, and partnerships that have related themes here. Here, because organizational silence, well, that's not working. So organizational silence is such a big issue, not in the sense that it's a big problem for us, but it's something we want to keep in mind all the time. And we've done various knowledge sharing workshops and events around that. So I have a link here to other information about this topic. So people can sort of go visit other sites related. So here, if I'm here and I see this map, this little bubble, I can, if I haven't seen the details, I'm reading this and I want to know more. So I want to click on here and go back to the details. So what this allows us to do is connect through these hyperlinks the higher level key insight and the details of what really happened that resulted in this particular insight. So you have the context in this map. And if you want more context, you should go read all the full documents. But you have sort of enough context here to understand where this insight comes from. And most people will probably start looking at the system in here. And then they want to dig to the lower level to figure out what really happened. So we're trying to address some of the issues with lessons learned systems in general, in the sense that they tend to not address the broader context within which that lesson came about. I want to stop here. Okay, what do I mean by organizational silence? Organizational silence has to do with psychological safety and the need for people within the project at all levels to feel secure enough to voice concerns, to not be fearful of reprisals, or make sure that everybody has a voice on the project. And if you see something wrong, you need to be able to raise your hand, raise the red flag, do whatever it takes to get attention and get something looked at. I hope that's good enough explanation for it. There were key instances in some of the bigger NASA accidents or disasters where people raised the red flag, and they obviously didn't speak up high enough, or didn't get the right channels, and just it was drowned in other conversations. So there's a lot of emphasis around making sure all the channels for communications are open, and people are free and comfortable in saying what they want to say, finding the right communication channels to say it. It's very important, especially at the lower levels, for the junior engineers not to be intimidated, and to ask questions and to point out things they don't understand, and not feel stupid, and really be free to speak their mind. So going back here, so once we did the pause and learn, where do these maps go? So I already showed you a little bit of some of the maps. They go into this KMap or knowledge map web, which is a collection of hyperlinked knowledge maps. And the conversation maps are the ones at the lower level that address the specific project. And the topic maps are the ones, or what I call it, the higher level, that address big topics. So communications is a big topic. The safety map for NOAA and Prime is a conversation map. And so the key insights are connected back and forth. All right. So this is what it looks like when you enter the system. On one side, you have links to all of the missions that are covered in the system. And this covers everything from small missions to very large things. And on the other side, you have all the key knowledge areas that I try to cover. And I did some work to figure out the most appropriate taxonomy, which were the topics that we needed to cover really. So I looked at, because my focus is on project management for the missions, I looked at basic taxonomies from the PMI, Project Management Institute, and adapted it to fit the specifics of NASA missions. So there's things like systems engineering, integration and testing, technology development that are not project management specific, but are very important for NASA missions. So I'm going to show you, well, I already showed you the NOAA and Prime example. So you get into a page like this, that's the overview for NOAA and Prime, and you have a number of maps here: integration and testing, organizing and staffing. And here you can link to case study that exists out there, the mishap investigation board report, and their lessons learned in the lessons learned information system. I can actually go there and show you. This is what a lessons learned actually looks like. And there should be a link to the bigger report, but that's what it looks like. And this is all public, so it's no problem. And the safety, you go to safety, and this is the map I showed you earlier. All right. All right. Any questions about these maps and how the system is constructed? Okay, I'm going to go back to here. Okay, right. So how are these maps used? So I put them into a SharePoint site and I wait for people to come. Well, that's obviously not going to work. So yeah, I do put them in a SharePoint site, and they're accessible. And I do monitor traffic to see if people are coming to see it or how to use it more efficiently. But mostly I organize monthly knowledge map workshops. So that's kind of the push versus pull. On the push side, I organize these workshops based on key topics. Well, until now, that's what I've done. So in January, I did one on stakeholder management and communications. February, it was project teams. March, it was partnerships. April, we had a big event, an all-day training event, so I embedded my session within that. Next Tuesday, I'm doing a workshop on project review. So what that means is I advertise the event just like any other workshop we do around here, but I use one of the big maps, like the communications map. I use one of these big maps as the beginning, the starting point for the conversation. And in this case, next Tuesday, I've also invited some subject matter experts. So they're going to be helping me to facilitate the conversation around this project reviews. And they bring in their own expertise. But there will be also people in the room who have participated in project reviews and will have their own ideas about how to do it right or whatever. So the point of these workshops with the maps in front of them, people have the maps in front of them and I have the maps on the screen and I can navigate and help them understand the mapping system also. The point is to use the maps as a starting point, but I don't present the maps as these are the things you need to do on a project. It's more, these are the things we've learned from other projects. You now need to think about what applies to your project, what applies in your case, how you would want to adapt these to your needs. So it's not a matter of these are the things you need to do. It's more a thinking tool. And the other thing I do, or I've started doing this month, is I put up a daily blog post within the SharePoint site where all these things are located. And each day I highlight one lesson from the map. As of today, only 2 people have accessed the blog, so I mean, it's a brand new thing. I don't expect them to all rush to it. But I want to eventually get people to subscribe to the blog post, or at least subscribe to specific topics they're interested in. So I'm trying to find new ways to further disseminate this information, but the workshops right now are the key. And also workshops can be organized around specific missions rather than topics. Right now I'm focusing on topics, but I could do it on missions as well. So, okay, there's a question about CMAP tools server. Okay, no, I'm currently the only person using CMAP tools, which is a challenge, and I'll talk about that later. I don't use the server. I just use it actually on a USB stick, and I transform the maps into HTML. So what you're seeing there is actually from CMAP tools. I just transform them into web pages, and that's how I put them on SharePoint. Ideally, the whole CMAP tool, the tool itself, the software, would be shared, and we could have a much more collaborative approach to this. It's just not possible right now. And right now, actually, I put the maps up. I don't really want people to start messing with them once they've been approved and reviewed and finalized. I do want feedback, and I get feedback during the workshops, and I can integrate some of that. But I don't really want people to start editing the maps. And there's another question. Approximately how many projects are completed per year, and do all of them get reviewed with the KMAP? In terms of numbers of projects completed per year, it's probably not that many. I mean, missions launching every year. It depends. We had a big year where there were maybe 5. This year it might be 2. I mean, it's anywhere between 2 and 5 that are launched. But the second part of your question is, well, there's 3 parts. Okay. No, I have not done K-maps with all of the projects. But what we're trying to do is a knowledge map, or at least a pause and learn session, not just at the end of a project, because some projects are 10 years long. You cannot wait until the end to capture lessons. That would be a big mistake. What we try to do is organize pause and learn sessions after each what we call KDP, key decision points. So there are major reviews by headquarters at specific points, milestones within the project lifecycle. We try to do a pause and learn after each of those. So my job is to run after the project once they've passed a key gate, and to sit down with them, figure out how to do a pause and learn, and then transform those things into map and aggregate all of it. It's not an easy task because they don't. There's no mandate for them to do it. There's no requirement for them to do it. Okay. Did I try other mapping software before CMAP? Yes, actually, the first few maps I did under the Chief Knowledge Officer here, when I came here, was using Inspiration. I love Inspiration. It's great. I ran into problems with it because I was developing such large interconnected, hyperlinked webs of maps that the system was crashing. And so CMAP looked like it was a much better match in terms of what I was trying to do. For individual maps, or maps with a few links here and there, Inspiration is fine. CMAP is also free, so that was another advantage. And I can put it on a stick and go around and do whatever I need with it. It's also been very robust in terms of numbers of maps that I can put together. Now, this might be a good time to show you a few other maps that have been done by NASA. So here, this one is completely different. This has nothing to do with my work. This was done in 2001, but it's also a CMAP around something related to NASA. It's Mars exploration. So you can see it has the same kind of things, links to other maps. And the more recent one, which looks very fancy, is this one, which is also about NASA-related things. Is about sustained U.S. human exploration. This one is more of a, well, it's a newer system, but you can see you can link to all kinds of, I'm not going to click, but you can link to all kinds of video. See, this is a little icon for videos, all kinds of links. And you can have a pretty sophisticated network of maps in there. All right. There are other questions popping up that I may read. What do you see as the flow aspect? Okay, the flow aspect. Here, well, this is where I was going. The flow has to do with making sure that individual reflection is transformed into something more robust with group reflection activities and validation through the pause and learn session. All of that is then aggregated into those maps. And then you don't have just this here at the pause and learn level is just within the team. So you really want to make sure that all of these valuable insights are not just aggregated, but are disseminated through these individuals all over the different projects. So there's really cross-project dissemination that you want, and mostly through the workshops and access to the site. It's not perfect, but we're trying to make sure that the knowledge doesn't stay just within the projects. Projects tend to be very insular, and they'll work very well within the team. They won't necessarily share their knowledge with other teams that have similar challenges. So we try to do a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas and things across projects. If you're starting scan from scratch, can PALs be used at even the smallest milestone? Yes, I think you could do a pause and learn. Actually, we do pause and learn also at the very, very early stages of projects, even before they've been approved. So in the proposal stage, the part of the project here are completed projects. So there's a proposal process going on, and at the end of the proposal process, before we even have a decision on whether the project has been accepted or not, we do a pause and learn to figure out what the team did well, didn't do well, they could have done it differently. So yes, you can do it very early on. You just have to make sure to focus it on something meaningful. Technically, you could do a pause and learn every month at a meeting, a review meeting, and figure out, integrate the same questions on a more regular basis. Do our approach get informed by any of the body of published research and or theory? So yes, and I have a couple of bibliographies that I can send or post on the site. One is specifically related to mapping and concept mapping and how it can be used for knowledge aggregation, knowledge sharing. The other bibliography is more around project-based knowledge management. And so I'm sure I've been inspired or in some way influenced by all of that. A great influence on my work also is obviously the Ed Rogers, who's been the Chief Knowledge Officer here at Goddard for quite a while. And I've worked with him for 4 years before sort of branching off and doing similar things with a different office within Goddard. But yeah, I can share some of the background. Now, I hesitate always to use the word concept map because what I really do is no longer a concept. But this one may be a concept map, but this is the real concept map. You know, it has the concepts are in the boxes, and then the linking words are clearly there. If I go back to some of my maps, this is not a concept. This is like a paragraph. So clearly, I've abused of what was meant to be done with CMap tools, but that's what I do. I just take a tool and play with it. All right. So let me see. To conclude and let you ask all kinds of questions. Information. Okay, some of the challenges that I'm encountering. I have a very soft mandate in the sense that systematic implementation is very difficult. The projects don't have to do this. They have a new requirement now that says that they need to have a lessons learned plan. So what I'm trying to do is I now have a plan template, and they should adjust that to their needs and put it in their program documents, but actually implement it. You know, having your lessons learned plan in your documents and not implementing any of it doesn't help much. So I'm kind of the person who has to run after them and make sure they do what they said in their plan or actually have a plan. They do a lot of knowledge sharing. They're very informal. I need to try to make it much more systematic. Another one is the utilization of the KMAT web at the project level for planning and or risk identification purposes. Ideally, I would want the project management team to go into this web of maps at regular intervals, maybe before key review, after key review, whatever. Look at the whole thing and think in terms of how does this apply to our projects? What are we missing? And they're not doing that yet. And this is still relatively new. The maps, I've been working on them for about a year, putting them on the web and making them accessible, you know, 9 months maybe. So it's still relatively new. So lack of integration in standard project practice. The projects are used to doing things their way, and they see knowledge management as this outside thing that people can help them with, but it's not part of it. Not that it's not part of their job, but it's not part of what they have in their schedule. If it's not in the schedule, it probably won't happen. And it's very highly dependent on project leadership team. So if I have a good relationship with the project manager, and they think highly of me, then they're more likely to do it. Some of them don't know my name, don't know who I am. It's very hard for me to establish that contact from where I sit. So that's a challenge. Another thing is acceptance of maps and mapping is not really something that's obvious. Some people just prefer the PowerPoint. So I've had people look at the maps online and ask me, can I have the equivalent PowerPoint? Of course, there's a PowerPoint there to begin with. So I'm still struggling with that, and I'm almost going back to preparing both linear documents and the maps to accommodate some people. All right, there's also finally a sustainability issue in terms of the use of the tool. It's a free tool, so it shouldn't be like a big problem in terms of making it available to a larger number of people within Goddard and having more people use it. Yet right now, I'm pretty much the only person using it. So I'm a contractor. Let's say next month I'm fired or whatever. I'm not here. Well, this whole thing falls apart. So it's not good. I've talked to people about this, so we're trying to figure out, is this worth keeping this tool working? Is this something we need to think about in the long term? All right, so let me see some of the questions that have come up. You share your lessons learned template, or at least an outline. I don't have a lessons learned template. Well, there's an official lessons learned template for NASA lessons in general, but I have a template lessons learned plan. I can try to figure out if I can share that. I don't know. I have to ask.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone so they can also just go ahead and just ask the questions.
Great, thank you.
This is Bob Newman. I'd like to thank you for a very nice presentation. I have one question here. Any of the content that's, Barbara, that shows up in the bubbles here, is that also mapped into any kind of data structure or reusable form?
That's a very good question. So when I've presented these maps at recent workshops, people have asked me many questions in terms of, okay, how is it searchable? Is there another way to access this information? Which leads me to believe that not everybody is comfortable with the mapping. So what I've done is I've started essentially taking all of the key concepts, the bubbles that exist within the higher level maps, like everything, key insights about communications, for example. And I've started transferring that to what is essentially a spreadsheet within SharePoint, where they're going to be able to search in other ways, because you cannot search the maps the way they are presented. You can only navigate along the lines of the two categories. Okay. So you can only navigate along missions and along knowledge areas. So I've aggregated this now into also a spreadsheet type format that's accessible through the SharePoint site.
I would not abandon your use of maps. I think they can be very valuable tools. What I would encourage you to explore is being able to render the maps from some kind of data store. In other words, if you've got all this collected in a database or something, some kind of accessible data store, and then being able to render these maps from that. And you could look at various renderings that way to meet various people's needs.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I have to explore that further because, for example, in a recent workshop, somebody asked, okay, how do I get all of the insights related to phase C of the project? Phase C is when they start actually building the satellite or the instrument. And right now I have no way of doing that. So if I had this data organized in a way where I could just pull what is needed in terms of sort of a search query that would build the map for me, that would be great. But right now, all these maps are handmade, hand-created. And yes, within CMAP tool itself, within the tool you can search, but not once they're transformed into web pages.
Does anybody have any more questions?
This is Denise. I just have one comment. I really enjoyed the presentation today, Barbara. Thank you so much. It's raised a question. In my mind, we had thought about offering sort of a non-credit workshop in concept mapping, especially working with the CMAP tool, because we teach that as part of our knowledge elicitation course now. But if there is interest in that, we could move that forward fairly quickly and make it available to everybody. You can let me know offline.
There are all kinds of other tools. CMAP tools has been for me the most flexible. I've used all kinds of other things. The most recent one I've tried is MindJet, but that's much more hierarchical and different types of things. Then mind maps are another completely different type of maps. And you have to think about whether you want a tool that's essentially for offline or if you want it to be a web-based tool. There are all kinds of options to think about.
Hi, my name is Mike Serkis. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I had a quick question for the man that asked the question about the rendering. What was your name again?
My name is Bo Newman.
Oh, okay.
What was your question?
Well, no, I was interested in what you said because I kind of related it to thinking about leave the data where it is, render it in such a way that a project manager or an ops manager or someone would, one, be aware of something that's going on as close to real time as possible, whether it's lessons learned or I don't care, whatever the case may be, budgetary decisions, whatever. Is that kind of what you meant, Bo?
Among many things. I've been involved in knowledge flow modeling now for a good number of years. And these are questions. If you would like to reach me afterwards, just drop me contact information on the chat line.
Will do.
Thank you.
So there was another question on the chat about it said to help institutionalize the pause and learn, could you make them part of go, no-go, or stage gate reviews? I would not do that. We have a lot of gate reviews already, and I want to make sure that the pause and learn is something of high value to the project themselves and not part of a review by an external party like headquarters review or management review. So the pause and learn is really meant to support the project and to be an internal tool. So I would not put it as a we keep talking about trying to make it institutionalized, but we don't want to make it a requirement because it would take on a different flavor.
Have you explored leveraging, I mean, and I don't know what happens at NASA, but I mean, obviously in software development, Agile is a huge movement, and there's a lot of discussion of the government, you know, and a lot of big players trying to institutionalize a thought of how do we introduce Agile-like methods, whether it's physical or software or whatever, into an environment. So have you looked at leveraging that type of, like the retrospective in software development or any other number of types of reviews, management type of reviews in Kanban or whatever? Is that kind of...
No, I have not. For now, what I've done is essentially take a practice that was developed by the Chief Knowledge Officer here and try to push it forward. Now, given some of the obstacles I've encountered, I'm really open to look at other types of reviews or adaptations of different techniques. Also, I know that within NASA, some people have taken the pause and learn and turned it into much more of a virtual conversation, where they can have people in different locations participate through a web-based tool. We do all of our pause and learn face-to-face as really an internal conversation, and we haven't done the virtual types, but there are other adaptations within NASA.
So is real quick question, I'm done. Is pause and learn then a NASA, like from the administrator's office down, or is it, you know, specific to your, because obviously all the directorates are very independent.
It's really something that started at Goddard and has been taken up by some of the other centers, not really a lot, but some of them do it in different ways. So it's definitely not a top-down thing. All right, if there are no additional questions, I just wanted to remind you that I have 2 related bibliographies that I can share, one about concept mapping and one about knowledge in project-based environments. I'd be happy to send them to whoever wants them, or even to put them on the website, Kent State University website.
That would be great. We have a speaker page and bio for you already, and if we could load them there, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay.
So if we don't have any more questions, then I would just like to say thank you very much, Barbara, for this presentation. It seems to it really generated a lot of interest, and I think we all took a lot from it.
Great, thank you. This was my first webinar, and look forward to doing more on different types of topics. Thank you.
Thank you.
And then the headquarters office in Washington. So I'm in Greenbelt, Maryland. And within the Goddard Space Flight Center, I work within the Flight Project Directorate. So essentially, what that means is I work for the equivalent of the Project Management Office. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the context, then I'll show you the knowledge flow model that I've put together. We'll do a small demo based on what I'm able to show you. And then I really want to talk about some of the challenges that I'm encountering, and I hope we'll have time for Q&A, but feel free to ask questions as I speak. So in terms of organizational context, so what we do here at Goddard are NASA missions. We're specialized in Earth science missions, meaning sending up satellites that essentially look down at Earth, as opposed to planetary science and other things that look at far distance in the universe and all kinds of other things. But we also do a little bit of everything. So we're one of the biggest centers, and we have a huge staff of scientists and engineers. I'm neither of those. I don't have a scientific background at all. I'm not an engineer. But somehow I managed to work on knowledge management for these folks. Kind of a paradox. So I work for the Project Management Office here. And
now directly supporting the Flight Project Directorate since 2011. In that capacity, she provides direct support. She provides direct support to projects through the development of project learning plans, implementation of pause and learn sessions to facilitate project learning, as well as the design and implementation of knowledge sharing workshops. In addition, Barbara aggregates project lessons and insights in a web of knowledge maps within the Flight Project Directorate's Knowledge Exchange. Prior to joining Goddard, Barbara worked as a research consultant and evaluation specialist supporting organizational learning and training functions. Primarily in the field of international development, Barbara earned a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh and a master's degree from Columbia University. And without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Barbara.
Great, thank you, Jake. And I think we tested the audio, so I hope everybody can hear me well. I will try to keep an eye on the chat if you have any questions. So I'm going to go through, it's not really a PowerPoint presentation, so I shouldn't call them charts, but a few screens. And I'll try to pause in specific places to allow you to ask for questions, but if I don't and I try to go too fast, just slow me down and we'll be okay. So I work at the Goddard Space Flight Center, like Jake said. So that's one of 10 centers within NASA. So there are 10 centers, a few other facilities doesn't launch properly or falls off even before it's launched. Anytime there is some kind of mishap, there is a very rigorous investigation. And those tend to result in very important lessons learned that are then embedded into practices and processes and all that. So I don't deal with those. I use them when there are some, but they're kind of parallel processes in terms of lessons. All right, let's move on to the next one. So more specifically related to the lessons learned context. And this is changing, so I'll talk to what has been the case up to now, but it is evolving very quickly. There was a policy or mandate, a requirement that said essentially the project will write or generate lessons learned. It wasn't very specific in terms of how they would do it or how often or whatever. It wasn't very very detailed in terms of telling the project what to do, which the project likes because they don't want to be told exactly what to do. So all these lessons were meant to be put into a lessons learned database. And there is such a thing. There is a lessons learned information system, LLIS, that most of it is public and is accessible on the web. In the end, very few people were using this database and very few people were contributing to it. And that resulted in 2012 into an OIG report, an Office of the Inspector General's Office report.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jake Spiegler, and I'd like to welcome you to our 9th KM KSU webinar. I'm a graduate student here at Kent State University, and I will be one of the viewer event facilitators over the next year. The KM KSU webinars are an open forum for anyone engaged or interested in knowledge management or knowledge sciences. In this community, we define knowledge sciences broadly and inclusively. Events and webinars are offered to expand the dialogue and also to provide exposure to people and organizations who are doing great things in this area, to advance ideas and to discuss challenges. We want this to be your forum, so we encourage you to propose events such as topics, events, and as we mentioned in our kickoff session, are not limited to just presentations, but can be open conversations and discussions, interviews, and so on. We're receiving very many interesting suggestions, and we have volunteers for another half a dozen events. Please do keep the ideas coming. This is an open forum which operates under a Creative Commons governance model. It is also a community without formal funding, so I want to always take time to acknowledge the contributions of our team here at Kent State, including Gianna Krensko, our Academic Program Coordinator, Nicole Stempak, another one of our graduate assistants, and our Goodyear Professor of Knowledge Management, Denise Bedford. Now let me introduce our speaker for today. Barabara Fillip is the Knowledge Management Project Manager with the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. She has been working as a contractor at the Goddard since 2008, first working in the Office of the Chief Knowledge Officer.
And most of what I focus on is really lessons learned or best practices or things related to project management specifically, which helps so I don't try to tackle the technical issues and the very difficult engineering challenges that people encounter. It is a very complex project environment in the sense that we have missions that are typically quite expensive. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars for a typical project or mission. They tend to be unique, and people here tend to say that we don't build the same thing twice, therefore it's very hard to draw lessons, but that's really the wrong kind of thinking. So I try to make them think in terms of, well, there are project management lessons or some kind of lessons around even engineering that can apply even if you do not build the same thing twice. So it's kind of challenging to work with, in a way, a lot of very, very smart people and still make them think in terms of what did really learn as a project on this in this experience, but if you learn that could be useful to others. So what I do in terms of lessons learned is really only one of several related processes. So for example, I put on the map here, anytime there is a mishap or something